In his summary of events, Chippendale made the following observations. The cockpit voice recorder transcript started at 001700 Zulu and covered the last 32 minutes and 50 seconds of the flight. At this stage, the aircraft was in the cruise of flight level 330. The last items of the descent checklist were being called for by the flight engineer, who reminded the pilots of the need to reset their altimeters through the transition altitude, which by definition was 18,000 feet. In so doing, the altimeter pressure datum would be recalibrated to height above sea level, rather than the 1013 millibar pressure datum, the reference adopted for flight at high altitude. Although some 25 hours of digital flight data recordings was available, only the last 41 minutes was read, starting with the aircraft at its cruising altitude of flight level 330. The quality of the readout was excellent, with very little bit loss, and with the loss of synchronization only occurring at the specific points where the tape spliced and at the moment of impact. Breakage of the tape in two places at impact caused some problems. However, following manual rearrangement of the raw data, all the available information was recovered. The isolated loss of information at the tape fractures was deemed not to be significant and did not affect the overall readout. Except for the last few seconds of the flight, the aircraft was flown with the number 2 autopilot engaged. Likewise, recorded data also indicated that the auto throttle was engaged during descent and approach to the accident site. Approximately 33 minutes before the accident, with the aircraft some 144 miles north of McMurdo, the captain indicated he would start his descent a little early. This was initiated by the standard practice of rotating the radar descent wheel to establish a rate of descent which reached approximately 2,900 feet per minute. As the aircraft approached the standard descent speed of 320 knots or Mach 0.82, the IAS hold mode was engaged. The engagement of this mode causes the aircraft to hold the speed as indicated, in this case 323 knots, but precludes the auto throttles being operated in the speed mode. In other words, the auto throttle under such circumstances would command idle power, with speed excursions, if encountered, being controlled by gentle autopilot changes to the pitch attitude. The flight crew had requested descent clearance to the minimum safe altitude for the leg of 16,000 feet. However, they were only cleared to flight level 180 or 18,000 feet equivalent by Mach Center. Approaching flight level 180, the vertical speed mode was engaged to reduce the rate of descent, with the aircraft subsequently capturing and maintaining this selected altitude. Throughout this period, the aircraft had been in nav track mode, tracking along the pre-programmed direct Hallett to McMurdo track with a grid heading of almost 360 degrees, or true south by conventional non-polar navigation. About 20 minutes before impact, the captain sighted a hole in the cloud cover which extended to sea level. He stated his intention to complete an orbit to get below the cloud. Further descent clearance was sought from Mach Center and approved, and the aircraft continued descending VMC in an orbit approximately 43 miles north of McMurdo. In order to complete the orbit maneuver, which would have obviously not been pre-programmed into the navigation computer, the nav track mode was disengaged by pulling out the heading select knob, with the aircraft thus being manually turned through the autopilot. In so doing, Collins had now taken direct control of manipulating the aircraft's lateral control. A right turn was commenced, although a preceding discussion between Casson and Maloney would seem to have suggested that clear air actually lay to the aircraft's left side rather than the right. Regardless, a further descent was started almost immediately, with Collins instructing Casson to set 10,000 feet in the altitude window for autopilot acquisition. Casson readily obliged. Subsequently, Casson advised McMurdo Center when they were descending through flight level 130. The pressure altitude recorded on the flight data recorder at the same time indicated that they had not yet set QNH, the sea level altimeter pressure datum. Although this would be identified as a procedural error on the part of the crew, coincidentally it played no part in the subsequent accident. A lengthy consideration was given to the sound of 3 altitude alerts at about time 0036 Zulu. The only logical explanation is that 11,000 feet was initially set in the altitude window, and after the first alert this was reset to 10,000 feet as the captain had instructed. After the second alert, the flight engineer confirmed his observation that 10,000 feet had indeed been set and armed. This is also confirmed by the aircraft automatically capturing and levelling out at an indicated altitude of 10,000 feet, which, because of the crew's previous oversight in resetting the altimeter pressure datum, was actually 9,400 feet above sea level. The aircraft rolled out of the first right-hand orbit on a selected heading of 344 degrees grid, and then remained on this heading for 1 minute and 20 seconds. The captain then stated that to stay VMC we would have to do another orbit. As a result, a left-hand turn was then commenced. The left turn was stopped on a heading of 179 degrees grid, almost exactly true north. On the captain's instructions, the co-pilot asked McMurdo Centre for a clearance to let down VMC on this heading, with the intention of proceeding visually to McMurdo. Immediately after this approval was given, a further descent was commenced. 2,000 feet was set and armed in the flight guidance system. Someone, probably an engineer, stated IAS hold, and at this time the modes changed from vertical speed, which was used to initiate the descent, to IAS hold. The airspeed at the time IAS hold was selected was 272 knots. A few seconds later, when the aircraft was passing through 9,300 feet, the captain stated that as it's VMC around his side, he was going to turn in again and immediately commenced the left turn, reversing his track over the icy water below as he steered the aircraft back towards McMurdo. While turning through a grid heading of 100 degrees, Collins stated that he would arm the nav mode again, and immediately the roll annunciator changed from heading select to nav capture and then subsequently nav track. Collins had now handed lateral navigation control back to the onboard navigation computer, and the aircraft was once again following the pre-programmed lateral navigation route, which, unbeknownst to any of the crew, was now taking the aircraft on a direct collision course with Mt.Erebus. Engagement of nav track was not immediately announced by the crew, possibly due to the distraction caused by answering McMurdo Centre's query on the height of the cloud tops and talking to the official flight commentator Peter Mahon, who arrived in the cockpit during the aircraft's last turn. Casson then advised McMurdo at 0045 Zulu, just 5 minutes before impact, that they were at 6,000 feet, descending to 2,000 feet VMC. However, with the altimeter subscale still not having been reset, 6,000 feet indicated was actually 5,400 feet true. Up to this point, the aircraft had been descending in the IAS hold mode, with a speed of around 272 knots on a rate of descent between 1,300 and 1,500 feet per minute. At 0045 and 35 seconds, the vertical speed mode was engaged. While this was an acceptable procedure to reduce the rate of descent as the assigned altitude approached, in this case the recorded rate of descent and accordingly the indicated airspeed both showed an increase in magnitude. Passing 3,500 feet, the airspeed was now 303 knots. It was considered most likely that such a manoeuvre was necessary in order to ensure that the aircraft remained clear of cloud. In response to the statement altimeters by some unidentified person, the captain reset his altimeter to the correct QNH as the aircraft passed through 4,000 feet indicated altitude. The co-pilot announced 1,000 to go as they passed through 3,000 feet, confirming both pilots' altimeters were now set to QNH, the sea level pressure datum. At 0046 and 25 seconds, just 3.5 minutes before impact, Collins called speed as he set 260 knots, which had previously been calculated and agreed to as the minimum safe speed the aircraft could maintain in the clean configuration. The auto throttles held the engines at low power until the aircraft decelerated in level flight, and this speed was reached. Then, power was reapplied to maintain this value. The altitude alert sounded 750 feet above the set altitude, and the aircraft automatically leveled off at 2,000 feet. Then there followed an 11-second gap between the time that this altitude was acquired and the vertical speed mode was again selected in response to Collins' comment stating that we might have to pop down to 1,500 feet here, I think. This decision was endorsed by his first officer, who himself commented, "Yes, probably see further in anyway." It was Chippendale's assertions at this stage that others on the flight deck did not share the pilot's confidence in the course of action being taken. Comments such as, "You're really a long while on instruments at this time," Bit thick here. What's wrong here? Make up your mind, you gotta go. All convinced Chippendale that Collins had now taken the aircraft at low level into an area of reduced visibility. As will be expanded on later, this opinion will be strongly disputed in subsequent cross-examination and remains one of the most controversial aspects of the subsequent investigation into Air New Zealand 901. McMurdo Centre were never advised of the descent to 1500 feet, although in truth there was no real reason why they should have been, other than by way of courtesy. The previous instructions from McMurdo was to descend in VMC and when convenient update the centre on the altitudes being flown. The DC-10's flight mode enunciator displayed alt hold at 0048 and 23 seconds, nearly 1.5 minutes before impact, with the aircraft level at 1,515 feet above sea level. One unusual aspect of the level off at 1,500 feet was that it was not as precise as other automatic level offs portrayed by the flight data recorder. Over the next 25 seconds, the aircraft continued a slow descent to a minimum altitude of 1,443 feet. Then it commenced a slow climb to reach a maximum altitude of 1,540 feet, just 17 seconds before impact. The final approach to the accident site was with the auto throttles in the speed mode, with 260 knots, or the equivalent of 482 km per hour, being commanded. The roll mode was selected to nav track, with the aircraft maintaining a grid heading of north, that being a conventional track of due south. Passage over the ice cliffs at the edge of Ross Island was noted by a reduction of 270 feet in 1.5 seconds on the aircraft's radio altimeter. This occurred 11 seconds prior to impact, which was exactly the timing achieved during later trials in the DC-10 flight simulator. As the slopes of Erebus began to rise rapidly beneath the aircraft, the rate of change of the DC-10's radio altimeter was recorded at nearly 6,300 feet per minute. The GPWS, or the Ground Proximity Warning System's hard warning, was triggered in the half second between the radio altitude sampling of 637 feet and 583 feet. Subsequent simulator reconstructions proved consistent, with the terrain warning being triggered at 610 feet. The timing of the flight engineer's call of 500 feet and 400 feet were also almost identical to the times noted during the simulator exercise. A study of the vertical acceleration data, which is sampled 8 times per second, showed that the aircraft experienced no significant turbulence or downdrafts during the later stages of the flight. The vertical acceleration trace reached a maximum value of plus 1.67 g just 2 seconds before impact. This is associated with a pitch up of the aircraft some 2.5 seconds before impact, from a level flight attitude of 5 degrees up to a maximum of 11 degrees nose up. No immediate change in altitude was recorded as a result of this pitch up, as the DC-10's inertia essentially kept it in level flight over this brief period of time. This pitch up resulted from a sudden application of nose up elevator 4 seconds prior to impact, resulting in a 7-degree change of controlled surface deflection over a 2-second period. Discrete data from the autopilot, which in this particular area contains some doubtful information as a result of the tape breakage, indicated that the number 2 autopilot was disengaged 4 seconds prior to impact. A sudden elevator input will cause the autopilot to disengage, and it appears that that is what happened as the crew reacted to the pull-up warning from the GPWS. 8 seconds prior to impact and 2 seconds before the GPWS warning started, the roll mode changed from nav track to heading select, as the heading select knob was pulled out. This would have been done to turn the aircraft through the autopilot and followed a discussion by the pilots on which way to turn to get out of their present position. Casson had stated it's clear to turn to the right, but Collins had then contradicted him. Despite this, most probably as a result of where the default heading reference lay at that exact moment, once the heading select knob was pulled out, the aircraft commenced an immediate roll to the right, reaching a maximum of 11-degree bank just 3.5 seconds prior to impact. Observing this, Collins then attempted to reverse the direction of roll back to the left, which had been his initial intention. This being the case, at the exact moment of impact, the aircraft had struck the ground while rolling left through a wing's level attitude. These rolling manoeuvres had no significant effect on the aircraft heading, which was last recorded as 359 degrees grid, or conventionally due south. In the last 3.5 seconds of flight, there was a sudden large application of left rudder of some 3 degrees, which rapidly increased to reach a maximum of 13 degrees left rudder angle just prior to impact. A study of the last 40 minutes of flight showed that the autopilot in the heading select mode only applied a maximum of 1 degree of rudder for very short periods. It was thus concluded that this rudder input was applied manually. Such an application and the resultant yaw generated resulted in a small change in lateral acceleration and skidding of the aircraft. This was to be the last recorded action of the crew of Air New Zealand 901. The last transmission received from the DC-10 was at 12:45 p.m. in the afternoon, or 00:45 UTC. The American staff at the ice tower therefore expected within a few minutes to see the aircraft coming into sight as it flew along the sound under the cloud cover at an altitude of between 2,000 and 1,500 feet. Looking a little to the right of McMurdo Sound, an observer on that day at the ice tower would note that Mt.Erebus, at 20 miles distant, was not visible, being surrounded by cloud. Then looking directly up the sound, he would observe that the 2,000 to 3,000 feet overcast extended from Ross Island over towards the centre of the sound and some distance beyond. Then looking a little further to his left, he would have an unobstructed view of the mountains of Victoria Land 40 miles away on the far side of the sound, and he would probably be able to see that there was no cloud at all in the area to the northwest. Therefore, looking generally northwards from McMurdo Airfield, the observer could not have failed to have seen the aircraft approaching him under the cloud base towards McMurdo Station. Within 8 minutes or so from the last transmission, it should have come into view, as visibility from the ground was quite clear. The minutes ticked by, and the time soon passed when the DC-10 should have been not more than 10 miles away from the head of McMurdo Sound. But it still didn't appear. For a short space of time it was assumed by the ice tower and by Mac Centre that the aircraft may have diverted over towards Victoria Land to take advantage of the clear skies in that direction. But by about 12:50 p.m. or 00:50 UTC, it was realised by the ice tower that there had been no radio communication from the aircraft since the transmission 5 minutes earlier, when the aircraft had advised that it was descending to 2,000 feet, flying VMC or in visual meteorological conditions. It will be recalled that this final message followed a previous notification from the aircraft that it would be flying in towards McMurdo. The radio operators at the ice tower and at Mac Centre thereupon initiated a series of radio calls to the aircraft. They called on different frequencies, but there was no reply. Mac Centre radioed local traffic to attempt to get contact with the DC-10, but without success. Thereafter, there were further unsuccessful attempts to locate the whereabouts of the aircraft. Neither Mac Centre nor the ice tower had any idea where the aircraft had gone. For all they knew, the captain may have changed his mind and flown away to the northwest to give passengers a look at the clear areas of Victoria Land, although the standard practice would have been to notify Mac Centre of that change of plan. By 2 p.m. or 02:00 UTC, the aircraft had been silent for nearly an hour and a quarter, whereas accepted procedure required the aircraft to have reported to Mac Centre at intervals of not less than 30 minutes. Consequently, Mac Centre radioed Air New Zealand headquarters in Auckland and advised that nothing had been heard from the DC-10 for an hour and a half. Mac Centre further advised Air New Zealand headquarters that it had therefore placed its search and rescue aircraft on standby. Aircraft were sent out on intensive searches, and ultimately after several hours the reason for the long radio silence from 901 was discovered. A United States Navy aircraft found the wreckage of the DC-10 on the northern slopes of Mt.Erebus at a point about 1,500 feet above sea level. There was no indication of any survivors. The time of impact was subsequently ascertained to have been 12:50 p.m. local, or 0050 UTC. The aircraft therefore crashed 5 minutes after the last radio transmission received by Mach Center. Whereas Mach Center had believed the aircraft was flying towards McMurdo down the centre of McMurdo Sound, the DC-10 had in fact been flying on a course 27 miles to the east. The captain, Collins, and Casson, his FO, must also have believed that they were flying down the broad and flat expanse of McMurdo Sound, for otherwise they wouldn't have notified their intention of approaching McMurdo Station at 2,000 feet. In addition, the aircraft had informed Mach Center that it was flying in visual meteorological conditions. If that was so, how did the crew fly the aircraft into the side of a 12,500 foot mountain? And how did it come to be flying on a course so far distant from McMurdo Sound? Both of these questions will be at the heart of any subsequent investigation. In New Zealand, the crash of the DC-10 had been notified to the Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, Ron Chippendale. On the 29th of November, he arrived at Antarctica with a party of other personnel and went to the crash site by helicopter as soon as weather conditions permitted. His first priority at the crash site was to locate two instruments which were vital if the last course of the aircraft was to be ascertained. The first of these was the Digital Flight Data Recorder, or the DFDR, colloquially known as the Black Box. The second was the Cockpit Voice Recorder, or CVR. With the recovery of this equipment, the hidden facts of the final stages of the flight might be wholly revealed. The black box would reproduce every detail of the aircraft's course, speed, altitude, and the manipulation of its controls throughout the whole of the journey. The CVR would contain a recording of all that had been said on the flight deck of 901 for the last 30 minutes of flight. Both these vital pieces of equipment were very quickly recovered undamaged. The tapes of the CVR were played back in New Zealand before being sent to the United States for transcription, as was the black box, so that details from its computer programming could be printed out. The entire wreckage site was surveyed by a Lands and Survey Department surveyor and an assistant from the New Zealand Ministry of Works and Development. The team surveyed and marked a grid of 30-metre squares over the complete wreckage train and a 30-metre buffer zone around this. They also plotted the position of each victim's remains and surveyed the profile of the terrain from sea level to the impact site. The collision of the aircraft with the ice-covered slope left a clear impression of the fuselage, wing-mounted engines and flap hinges, which showed that 901 was in a wings-level nose-high attitude when the impact occurred. The wreckage trail was typical of a high-speed impact and resulted in extensive fragmentation of the underside of the wing and fuselage. The wing engines were stopped immediately upon impact due to the huge distortion forces caused by their sudden contact with the ice. These wing-mounted engines, the underside of the wing and bottom of the rear fuselage, bore the main impact of the collision, and some debris from each of these areas was evident in the impact crater. Immediately following the initial impact, the aircraft lofted over the mound of ice and snow displaced in the impact area and continued forward and upward in a wings-level attitude in the direction of the volcano's summit. Extensive destruction would have continued until the wreckage came to rest, which would have been accentuated by an air pressure differential of approximately 1.1 psi between the interior of the fuselage and the outside environment. The remaining engine, number 2, mounted in the tail fin, continued to deliver considerable power after impact. The integrity of the fuselage was breached early in the breakup sequence, and the majority of the victims were ejected before the last of the wreckage came to rest. Most of the remainder were thrown clear by the final impact itself. The spread of the wreckage covered a total area which was some 570 metres by 120, and was aligned on a bearing of 357 degrees grid or 190 degrees true. The wreckage area's uphill slope from the point of impact was 13 degrees, with a 5-degree cross slope downhill from right to left. The accident site was located on the top of a solid layer of ice which had a light covering of dry powder snow. 2 deep crevasses crossed the area of the main wreckage trail, but much of the lighter debris was moved onto an adjacent, extensively crevassed area by subsequent storms and was never recovered. Although the aircraft had increased its pitch-up attitude and engine power was increasing immediately prior to impact, its flight path was essentially straight and level when it collided with the slope. The largest portion of the aircraft remaining was the section of the cabin which remained attached to the wing's centre and inboard sections. This portion was at the forward end of the wreckage train and was the epicentre of a persistent, intense and deep-seated fire. The upper forward fuselage section, which contained the front galley and flight deck, came to rest short of and to the left, that being the east side of the main fuselage section, and although it was extensively damaged, it was not involved in any fire. The entire length of the wreckage trail was impregnated with aviation fuel and covered with soot. The aircraft was in the normal configuration for cruise flight, with both undercarriage and augmented wing lift devices in the retracted position. The horizontal stabilizer jack screw had indicated that a nose-up trim of 2 degrees was applied at the time of impact, consistent with high-speed level flight. The evidence in the wreckage trail indicated that a fire was ignited immediately after the impact, and that a persistent fire raged in the centre section of the fuselage but aft of the front galley. The residual fuel in the left wing tank, which was the only fuel tank to retain their essential integrity, probably sustained this fire for a period of time. The source of ignition was not determined. The fire did not involve the fuselage interior immediately after impact, and many of the victims showed no evidence of being burnt. The fire burnt itself out before the wreckage was located, therefore no firefighting equipment was involved. All of the aircraft's occupants who were recovered were killed by the injuries sustained as a result of the deceleration of the aircraft. A review of the flight crew's medical records disclosed no evidence of pre-existing physical problems which could have affected their judgment or performance. The post-mortem and toxicological investigation did not reveal any abnormalities in any of the flight deck crew members. An extensive effort resulted in most of the victims being recovered. Of these, 213 were identified. All those recovered were subjected to a post-mortem examination in Auckland. The results of these examinations indicated that all the victims were killed by the injuries received at the initial impact rather than as a result of burns sustained in the subsequent fire. With the early suggestion that Collins may have taken the aircraft low in poor weather conditions, Chippendale moved quickly to gather first-hand observations from other pilots who were operating in the area in or around the time of the accident. At approximately 0100 Zulu 10 minutes after the accident, a United States Navy C-130 aircraft was inbound to McMurdo along the military route. This is a predetermined arrival routing which would take the aircraft down the Sound as far as Bird Waypoint at 77.5 degrees south, 165 degrees east. Upon reaching this waypoint, the aircraft would alter course to Williams Field, and in so doing avoid the terrain of Ross Island. Some 80 miles out, the crew observed the prevailing weather conditions as a continuous stratiform layer covering Ross Island, with cloud domes over both Mt.Erebus and Mount Terror, which concealed the mountains from view. The cloud layer extended to the north of Ross Island. A lenticular cap cloud was over Mt.Erebus above the main cloud layer. The aircraft descended into cloud at approximately 16,000 feet and remained in variable cloud densities except for one break of about 1,500 feet vertically until it descended through 2,500 feet. The lowest layer was solid overcast with a ragged base. The visibility was good below the cloud base, but surface definition was poor. The aircraft encountered light turbulence during the descent, but with no evidence of icing, and landed at McMurdo's ice runway at 0120 Zulu approximately 30 minutes after the accident. At 0105 Zulu, approximately 15 minutes after the accident, a helicopter flying over the slopes of Mt.Erebus above Cape Royds attempted to ascend over the saddle between Erebus and Mount Bird. The cloud base was above the saddle, but the pilot turned back due to the poor surface definition in the area at the time, and decided to enter Lewis Bay via Cape Bird itself. The aircraft landed at Cape Bird Hut at 0140 Zulu, where the weather was reported as overcast with a southerly wind and light snow. The helicopter later took off and flew around Cape Bird at 1500 feet and was below the cloud base all the way. At 0200 Zulu, it landed on the beach 10 kilometers from the accident site, and the conditions at the time were overcast with light snow, but the sun could reportedly be made out through the cloud on occasion. The surface definition at the time, however, was very poor to nil. The aircraft encountered no turbulence on the approach into a light northwest wind for landing. It remained on the ice for about 50 minutes, during which time the sky continued overcast, with the visibility decreasing due to snow flurries, a deterioration which eventually forced them to cut short their visit. Beaufort Island could be distinguished to the north, but was not clearly defined. The crew subsequently reported that they were not able to distinguish the elevated slopes to the south, nor were they able to separately identify cloud from snow. No bare rock was visible on the slopes of the terrain, however the rocky coastline below the ice cliffs was visible. As the aircraft returned to Bird Hut, the crew found weather conditions there much the same as they had been when they departed. A further 30 minutes behind the C-130 followed a United States Air Force C-141 Starlifter. The captain of this flight made a report of his recollection of the prevailing conditions after his arrival at McMurdo. As we approached McMurdo, we noticed that Ross Island was obscured by cloud. No terrain was visible. We displaced our flight path to the west approximately 25 miles to allow for a gradual long-range descent over the water. At the time, we were navigating entirely by INS. We maintained 16,000 feet until McMurdo picked us up on radar, which, as I remember, was at about 38 miles. We began descent and entered the clouds immediately. The cloud cover appeared to be ordinary cumulus or stratocumulus. We encountered only light rime icing and light turbulence during descent. Between approximately 12,500 feet and 11,000 feet, we passed between cloud layers. Visibility seemed good between the clouds, but no terrain was visible. We broke out of the cloud base at approximately 5,000 feet. Visibility beneath the ceiling was good, and we landed at McMurdo at 0152 Zulu on the 28th of November. This was approximately 1 hour after the accident. But it was eventually the passengers themselves of Flight 901 who were to provide the definitive insight into weather conditions at the time of the accident. As 901 was in the Antarctic specifically to afford those on board a unique opportunity to witness the frozen continent firsthand, Chippendale was to be afforded an opportunity to see what they had seen, through the many rolls of undeveloped film recovered from numerous cameras found in the wreckage. This film was developed at McMurdo Station, and some hundreds of prints soon became available to the investigating team. The quality of the prints was not always good, but on the whole they were quite clear. A pictorial record was thus obtained of the aircraft's progress for some hundreds of miles before it collided with Erebus, culminating in some photographs being taken mere seconds before the aircraft was lost. There was even the film of a movie camera which had been running at the exact moment of impact. The film showed scenes to the east, west and north. Understandably, none showed conditions to the south, as this was the aircraft's direction of travel. The Superintendent of New Zealand's Antarctic Division of the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research studied all of the processed film that was recovered from the passengers' cameras. As such, he was able to determine and demonstrate that the aircraft had followed a track over northern Victoria Land, consistent with that intended of the aircraft's flight plan, and had approached Ross Island on track. Before crossing the coast of Ross Island and having passed to the east of Beaufort Island, the aircraft had obviously completed some descending turns. The photographs studied indicated that in many cases the last or second to last photographs were taken when the aircraft was in a position about 6 miles east of the island, while the aircraft was heading in a southerly direction. In a number of other cases, the last photographs, again some taken only seconds before the collision, showed the eastern shoreline of Cape Bird and the northeastern and northwestern coastline of Lewis Bay, and a cloud layer with a base of some 2,000 feet above an unbroken snow-covered slope. The riddle of the weather was, by this means, resolved. It was apparent that the aircraft at the time when it struck the mountain had been flying in clear air. Those photographs taken within seconds of impact removed all doubt. The flying in cloud theory simply didn't add up. The view to both the left and the right of the aircraft just prior to impact was clear for many miles. To the left, and clearly visible under low cloud, was a thin strip of black rock indicating the shoreline of Cape Tennyson about 13 miles away. To the right, also clearly visible under cloud, was a thin black strip of rock and lower slopes of Cape Bird, indicating its shoreline about 10 miles away. It therefore follows that as the aircraft approached Mt.Erebus, it was flying in skies in which there was perfectly clear visibility for at least 23 miles. It also confirmed that 901 had been flying well below the cloud base when the collision occurred. But what quickly becomes apparent, and what will, it's alleged, influence Chippendale's interpretation of the subsequent cockpit voice recorder transcript, is his belief that if the passenger's photographic evidence could definitively establish where the aircraft was, how come Collins and his crew could not? Chippendale is of the mind that despite the change to the flight plan's destination coordinates, this, he believes, is of limited significance, and that enough clues were present for the crew to fix their position, had they been looking for them, which as professional pilots, he believed they should. In formulating a conclusion as to the cause of the accident, one could be critical of Chippendale himself for being more focused on how 901 had been lost, without providing much illumination as to why it was lost. From an investigative perspective, these are most definitely not one and the same. His final submission acknowledged the following facts. The flight plan route entered into the company's master computer was altered after the crew's initial route briefing, conducted some 19 days before the accident, insofar as the position for McMurdo and the computer printout used at the briefing differed by over 2 degrees of longitude from the plan produced on the morning of the flight itself. The system of checking the detailed flight plan entries into the master computer was also deemed to be inadequate, in that this error of 2 degrees of longitude persisted in a flight plan for some 14 months before being finally identified. Air New Zealand had asserted that the briefing material had been in error and that it was subsequently corrected prior to 901's departure on the morning of November 28th. The briefing conducted by Air New Zealand contained omissions and inaccuracies which had not been detected by either earlier participating air crews or the supervising airline inspectors of the National Regulatory Authority, the Civil Aviation Division. Some diagrams and maps issued at the route qualification briefing on the 9th of November could have been misleading in that they depicted a track which passed to the true west of Ross Island over a sea-level ice shelf, whereas the flight plan track passed to the east over high ground reaching up to approximately 12,500 feet above mean sea level. The question of making a landing near McMurdo on either the ice runway or the skidways at Williams Field, and the type of emergencies which might require such a diversion, were not discussed at the company's brief. The Civil Aviation Division airline inspectors had formally approved the audio-visual stage of the route qualification briefing, and one had witnessed a typical audio-visual segment of a briefing for an Atlantic flight twice without requiring any amendments or detecting the errors contained in the briefing. They had also confirmed that it was no longer necessary for captains to carry out a supervised flight as required in the operation specification in view of these briefings and the flight simulator detail. Thus it came to be that of all 901's flight deck crew, only flight engineer Brooks had previously operated the route down to Antarctica. However, that said, Chippendale was of the opinion that despite the shortcomings of some aspects of the route qualification briefing, this flight, and Antarctic flights in general, were not unacceptably hazardous if they were conducted strictly in accordance with the route qualification briefing as presented. The operator had departed from the stated undertaking to carry 2 captains on each flight. Instead, Air New Zealand had substituted an additional first officer in lieu of the second captain. This had occurred because of the regulator's practice of reapproving Antarctic flights each season on the condition that they complied with the constraints of the previous season's flights. Over time, liberties had been taken, such as this, whereby some items had been discontinued without formal notification or agreement. Providing an insight into the relationship between Air New Zealand and the regulator, Chippendale noted how the airline had consistently acted in a manner so as to apply subtle pressure on the authority in order to achieve more favourable operating terms. With regard to cockpit practices, Chippendale also noted that the crew had not observed the transition level in use in the McMurdo air traffic control area for the resetting of aircraft altimeters. This procedure had not been published in either the briefing notes or the US Department of Defense documents which were made available to the crew. The procedure expected to be adopted was that prescribed in US Federal Aviation Regulation 91.81, which requires the QNH, or local sea level pressure, to be set as the aircraft descends through flight level 180. As a statement of fact, the captain's altimeter was not set to the correct QNH until the aircraft reached 3,500 feet. Although undoubtedly true, the oversight on the part of both Collins and Casson was in this particular case inconsequential in the context of 901's collision with the ice. In the context of 901's descent towards the Antarctic ice, Chippendale remains factual in what his investigation has revealed. The captain initiated a descent to an altitude below both the IMC 16,000 foot minima and VMC 6,000 foot minima for the area in which the aircraft was operating. This fact, although admittedly completed in an area of clear air, was in contravention of the operator's briefing and outside that sector previously approved for the descent to 6,000 feet by both the regulator and the airline. This descent was intentionally continued below the VMC limit specified by the regulator and the airline of 6,000 feet to an indicated altitude of 1,500. An explanation as to why Collins engaged in such an apparent willful non-compliance was not forthcoming. A partial explanation of why Cassons allowed Collins to behave in such a manner is advanced here, but in no way exonerates the first officer. The co-pilot was devoting a significant proportion of his time in an endeavour to establish VHF contact with the McMurdo ground station and did not monitor the decisions of the pilot in command adequately, in that he did not offer any criticism of the intention to descend below MSA in contravention of company restrictions and basic good airmanship. Based on his own interpretation of the cockpit voice recorder data, the final report on more than one occasion suggests a belief on Chippendale's part that the aircraft, if not actually flying in cloud, was proceeding towards a cloud-covered area, and he is of the opinion that of all the crew members, only the flight engineers ultimately voiced their concern and apprehension. The flight engineers endeavoured to monitor the progress of the flight and expressed their dissatisfaction with the descent towards a cloud-covered area. Although being somewhat surprised of the fact that the aircraft's track would be planned directly over an active volcano, he qualifies his remarks to indicate that this act in itself is not inherently dangerous provided certain precautions are adhered to. Although the route selected by Air New Zealand for the approach to McMurdo crossed almost directly over a 12,450 foot active volcano just 20 miles from destination, in preference to the normal approach path of military aircraft, which was across the sea level ice shelf, the Air New Zealand route was safe, provided the crew observed the minimum altitude stipulated for the flight and no extraordinary activity occurred in the volcano. Chippendale's second point is most probably factually correct and affords some explanation as to why communications between the aircraft and the base at McMurdo had proven so problematic. The failure of the aircraft systems to both establish satisfactory VHF communication and subsequently to lock on to the McMurdo TACAN was probably due in no small part to the aircraft's low altitude in conjunction with significant high ground between it and the associated ground equipment. In the third paragraph, Chippendale makes an assessment of what he believes to be the crew's mental state of alertness. The crew were distracted but not preoccupied by their inability to raise the ice tower or any other local ground station on VHF. The same was inferred of their inability to lock onto the TACAN or obtain any positive ground radar identification. In this observation, Chippendale will state what he has ascertained to be true, without providing any insight into how such a policy change had impacted upon the pilot's behaviour and understanding. The company deleted an earlier requirement for VMC descents to be monitored by radar and substituted the alternative procedure of contacting the radar controller for the mere coordination of the descent. With regard to the technical aspects of the aircraft's operation, Chippendale recorded it as a statement of fact that the onboard navigation and flight guidance systems operated normally during the latter stages of the flight. The aircraft's GPWS, or ground proximity warning system, operated in accordance with its design specifications. The aircraft was not fitted with a self-activated ELT, or emergency locator transmitter, while recognising that such equipment was not a regulatory requirement at the time. The aircraft's cockpit voice recorder and digital flight data recorders operated as intended and provided an excellent record for the investigating team. Controversially, however, he also makes a statement implying that had Collins been using his onboard weather radar in its mapping function, the terrain ahead would have been depicted. The aircraft's radar would have depicted the mountainous terrain ahead. The issue of the survival equipment carried on board, or more correctly the lack of such equipment, was again highlighted in Chippendale's report. Although his remarks are factually correct, due to the nature of the accident, any discussion surrounding the topic of survival equipment is somewhat academic. The content of the report, however, reads as follows. The regulator had not implemented effectively the section of ICAO standards detailed in Annex 6 of the Convention, which requires appropriate life-sustaining equipment to be carried on flights across land areas which have been designated by the state concerned as areas in which search and rescue would be especially difficult. Although the commander of the US Navy Antarctic Support Force stated that limited search and rescue capabilities existed over land and very little over water, this may not constitute designation of the area as being especially difficult for search and rescue activities by the state concerned. Although some notes on Antarctic survival were given to the chief purser immediately before his flight, no additional life-sustaining equipment was carried or training given to the crew members to facilitate survival following an emergency landing on the ice or in the polar waters of Antarctica. With regard to the impact itself and the subsequent search operation, Chippendale states that neither the passengers nor the crew were expecting the collision, and all received fatal injuries on impact with the ice. The search and rescue organisation was mobilised and coordinated in a competent manner despite the difficult environment, and the aircraft was located as soon as practicable, approximately 11 hours after the collision occurred. Thus, in conclusion, Chippendale states that the probable cause of this accident was the decision of the captain to continue the flight at low level towards an area of poor surface and horizon definition when the crew was not certain of their position, and the subsequent inability to detect the rising terrain which intercepted with the aircraft's flight path. So, despite reservations in relation to the involvement of other interested parties, he has essentially pointed the finger of blame at the crew, or, to be more exact, Captain Jim Collins. In so doing, he has come to the conclusion that Collins had made a decision to willfully disregard both Air New Zealand's and the regulator's altitude hard floors, and had acted in a deliberate manner to descend the aircraft all the way to 1,500 feet above the icy waters of the Antarctic. Although established that the aircraft was clear of cloud on its approach to Ross Island, his evaluation of the CVR fully convinces him that what he has heard is apprehension on the part of the flight engineers in particular, with regard to the deteriorating weather ahead of the aircraft. Indeed, the crew's ultimate lack of urgency and apparent failure to visually acquire the mountain ahead only acts to reaffirm his belief. Furthermore, although acknowledging that the destination waypoint had been shifted prior to 901's departure, and that the fact had not been communicated to the crew, Chippendale sees this as largely immaterial and inconsequential. His belief is that sufficient clues existed for Collins and his crew to establish an accurate fix on the aircraft's position, and that their failure to do so was indicative of their collective shortcomings in adequately monitoring their position with relation to the local topography. Within days, as the Royal Commission of Inquiry convenes, it will quickly become apparent that not everyone sympathises with the Chief Inspector's viewpoint, and so, rather than bringing with it closure, his report will only feed into what will ultimately be the most forensic of examinations into what really happened to Air New Zealand 901, an investigation which, once completed, will claim many a reputation, not least of which will be that of the presiding Justice Peter Mahon.